Hi again. We are going to finish up our lectures on chapter 10, which is genetic inheritance. So I am going to share my screen and we're going to get to the rest of this PowerPoint. So here is where we left off. And last time we were talking about how Mendel deduced the laws of inheritance and all kinds of fun stuff like that. We were talking about peas, and that isn't particularly relevant to us, right? And so, but it also applies to humans. Okay, so Mendel's laws, whether it's about cross-fertilizing or self-fertilizing or your different patterns of inheritance, like with your dominant and recessive alleles and things like that, all of it is relevant to human genetics as well. So Punnett squares, they're also useful for tracking the inheritance of genetic disorders such as cystic fibrosis. So if we are looking at a person's genes, okay, it's a genetically inherited disorder, cystic fibrosis is, and it's a recessive disorder. And if you'll remember from last time, the only way that you can get a recessive disorder or a recessive trait is by having two copies of that recessive allele. Okay, so in this case, is we're going with F. It doesn't matter if you're using F or A or H or Y or whatever letter you want to use for these Punnett squares. It doesn't matter at all. But what I want you to see is that if this is a recessive trait, a recessive disorder, then you have to have two recessive alleles in order for you to have cystic fibrosis, or in order for you to have blonde hair, for instance. Okay, so there was just a gigantic, okay, sorry. I'm out here and it's like Jurassic Park. So if you have an individual with two recessive alleles, that person is affected with cystic fibrosis, meaning that they have cystic fibrosis. And if they aren't showing symptoms yet, then they will, because they've got cystic fibrosis. Now, on the other hand, if you are homozygous dominant, meaning that you're homozygous, so you have two of the same allele and it's the dominant allele, so big F, for instance, then you're what's known as a healthy non-carrier. Okay, so you're a healthy individual. You do not even have a single little f allele that you could pass down to your offspring. So a carrier means you have a mutated copy of the allele, but since it's a recessive trait, you're not going to express that trait. You are not going to have cystic fibrosis because your body takes over and just uses the dominant, the non-mutated copy of that gene. All right, so then you could also have individuals that are heterozygous. And if you're heterozygous, then you are what is known as a carrier. And in this case, you would be a healthy carrier because even though you have this little f, you're not affected because your body is going to preferentially express that dominant trait of not having cystic fibrosis. So a healthy non-carrier means that you don't even have the little f and you're healthy, okay? And cannot pass it on to your children. If you're a healthy carrier with that little f, some of your offspring will get the dominant trait, some of your offspring will get the recessive trait, okay? So you are passing that down genetically from generation to generation. And then if you are affected, you've got two recessive alleles, and the only thing that you are able to give to your offspring is that little f, okay? So you will be passing that down no matter what. For people who have cystic fibrosis or any number of genetic disorders, if you have a recessive genetic disorder, you will pass that on to your children. Now, is that a death sentence for your children? No, it's not, because if a person who has cystic fibrosis, are they just not going to have kids? No, of course they can have children. So if you partner an affected individual with a healthy non-carrier, none of their children will have cystic fibrosis. All of them will be carriers of cystic fibrosis, but none of them would be affected. If you paired an affected individual with a healthy carrier, and we can do this over here, right? So this is from last time. I'm going to erase some of it. All right, so if you paired an affected individual, so little f, drawing our Punnett square, with a healthy carrier. Okay, so a healthy carrier means that they have a dominant allele and a recessive allele. And if we go through and make our Punnett squares, big F, little f, big F, little f, little f, little f, little f, little f, what proportion or percentage of these individuals are affected? Half will have cystic fibrosis, half will be carriers of cystic fibrosis. So they won't actually have it, but they will be able to transmit this little f, this affected allele, onto their own offspring. Okay, so people with cystic fibrosis, people with any number of genetically inherited disorders are definitely able to have children, and healthy children. Okay, it just sort of depends on your partner. And we talked a little bit about that in our chapter 11 about DNA technology. So something where you can, so say that me and my husband are both healthy carriers of the cystic fibrosis gene. If you have a mother, that's this example actually, if you have a mother that's a healthy carrier and a father that's a healthy carrier, you have 25% chance that your child will not be affected and will not even carry the mutated copy of that gene. 25% big F, 50% that likelihood that you'll get a carrier. Okay, so will not be affected by cystic fibrosis, but will carry it. And then 25% of your offspring will be affected. Now, if this was a big thing to us and we didn't want our children to be carriers, did not want our children to be affected, or in this situation over here that we just did, where it would be half, a 50% chance that our children would be affected, then that's a situation where pre-implantation genetic diagnosis can come in. And you know, you harvest eggs and then you harvest sperm, you put them all together and you make embryos, and then you test those embryos for which ones of them are healthy carriers, healthy non-carriers, or are affected individuals, and then you can implant into the female's uterus the embryo or embryos that are not affected or are carriers. Oops. All right, now, so a lot of times we're not just tracking one trait, okay? A lot of times we're tracking multiple traits, or a single trait is determined by multiple genes, okay? So it's not always one gene, one trait, meaning that it's not one gene that determines your eye color, for instance. It's multiple genes that come together to determine your eye color. So when you're tracking 2 or more genes on a Punnett square, on a single Punnett square, it is super challenging. It is super time consuming. Why would you do that? Okay. Super error prone. You wouldn't do that. Okay. Instead, the product rule simplifies these problems. It is a super easy tool for you to use in order to determine the probability that offspring will have a particular genotype. Okay. So I'm going to show you how the product rule works. And the only thing that you need to be able to do with the product rule is multiply fractions. And lucky for you, multiplying fractions is literally the easiest thing you can even do with a fraction. Okay, so let's do it, because it doesn't matter if they all have the same denominator. Okay, so I'm going to tell you how the product rule works, and then I'm going to show you how we go about the math, because I know a lot of you get like real freaky about math. So let's say that you have 2 parents that are heterozygous. Both of your parents are heterozygous for genes R, Y, and T. Your mother is heterozygous for R, heterozygous for Y, heterozygous for T. Your dad is the same thing. The sperm right here, heterozygous for R, het for Y, het for T. That's what we call it. Geneticists say het or homo. Okay, so if you cross a heterozygote by a heterozygote, you have 25% chance that you have a quarter big R, a quarter, little r, half, okay, 2 out of 4, excuse me, half heterozygotes. So let's say that both of your parents are heterozygotes for genes R, Y, and T, and you're looking for the probability that your children, the offspring, are also going to be heterozygous for genes R, Y, and T, okay? Oh my gosh, I'm gonna sneeze all over the place. Oh my gosh, it's killing me right now. I think we've got an oak tree somewhere. I'm like dying. There's pollen all over the cars. Jesus. All right, so what you're gonna do, this is basically like if I said, I want a girl and I want her to have brown hair and I want her to have brown eyes, okay? The probability of her being a girl has nothing to do with her having brown hair or having brown eyes. The fact that she's a girl, it makes those other things, it doesn't change the likelihood of those two other things happening. So whenever you say, I want this to happen, and I want this thing to happen, and I want this thing to happen, you're multiplying the probabilities of those together. Now, if you want to put together your perfect little offspring, and you put many, many things, say, I want it to be a girl and have brown hair and have brown eyes and be 5'2", and like all of these things, the likelihood of all of those things happening at once becomes less and less and less and less with every condition that you're putting on it, okay? So likelihood here that you have an offspring heterozygous for R is half, okay? Then independently, what is the probability in a separate Punnett square that your offspring is heterozygous for Y? Half. Separately, totally in its own Punnett square, what's the likelihood that your offspring will be heterozygous for T? Half. Now, all you do is if I say, I want this and this and this, I'm multiplying those probabilities together, okay? So 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. Now, I'm gonna show you how we're doing this. It is so easy, you're gonna die. All right, so if I have half chance, okay, 50% chance that my offspring will be a girl, and 1/2 probability that she'll have brown hair, and 1/2 probability that she'll have brown eyes. I'm just multiplying these together. So first, you multiply your numerators, the numbers that are on top. What is 1 times 1 times 1? 1. Then you multiply your denominators, the numbers on the bottom. What is 2 times 2? 4. What is 4 times 2? 8. All right, so 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8. Now, you've got 1/8 probability of all of those things happening, okay? So getting an offspring that has all of these traits. That's all you're gonna do. Okay, let's do another one. Let's say that you had 1/4 times 1/2 times 1/2. All right, well, so 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 1/16. Okay, now what if there will be a situation where a condition cannot happen? Okay, so for instance, like you get two, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. You will get situations where something cannot happen. Okay, so for instance, if my husband and I were both recessive for a particular trait, homozygous recessive, we would not end up with an offspring heterozygous for something. We wouldn't also end up with an offspring that was homozygous dominant for a particular trait. So our next example, what if you had half a chance of having a female offspring, a quarter chance of having brown hair, and you could not have brown eyes. Okay, let's just say that that was a thing. So what do you do here? Well, if one of those three things has absolutely no way it could happen, if you're multiplying anything at all by 0, this is 0. It cannot even happen, okay? Nothing cannot happen, okay? So if you cannot make brown eyes from two people, and you want a girl with brown hair and brown eyes, that cannot happen, okay? That would be 0. On the other hand, if I just said that me and my husband are both homozygous recessive for a trait, and we wanted to know what was the chance that our offspring was also going to be homozygous recessive for a trait, that's 100%. He or she will be, right? Now, if we get this same thing over here, okay? Half chance of offspring being a girl, quarter chance of her having brown hair, and 1 for her having blue eyes, okay? Meaning it will happen. So here, what is 1 times 1 times 1? 1 is just 1 over 1. You like literally just ignore it. So 1 times 1 is 1. What is 2 times 4? 8. You don't have to take this into account because it will 100% of the time happen. Will happen. Let us go back to the share screen. All right, so the product rule is just the chance that 2 independent events will both occur, meaning that an individual having brown hair has nothing to do, it doesn't increase or decrease the odds of that individual being a boy or girl at all, okay? You can have one thing happen and it totally does not affect the other thing happening. Okay, so the chance that 2 independent events will both occur equals the product of the individual chances that each event will occur. So this has to occur, and this has to occur, and this has to occur. Every time you say and, the product of the individual chances, you're multiplying these chances together. Okay, so here, probability that an offspring inherits the heterozygous genotype for all 3 of these traits is equal to the probability of, what's the probability of that offspring being heterozygous for R? What's the probability of that offspring being heterozygous for Y? What's the probability of that offspring being heterozygous for T, and multiplying those probabilities together. And to keep it like simple for you, don't do percents. Don't do percents. Your answers are either going to be 1, 0, a quarter, a half, 3/4. That's it. Okay, so just stick with those. And then you're multiplying them together, so then you can get freaky numbers, but I'm gonna keep it pretty simple for you for your questions. All right, so next you can have sex-linked genes, okay? And sex-linked genes will have unique inheritance patterns. So if you have a sex-linked gene, that means it is linked to your sex chromosomes. What are your sex chromosomes? They are your X or your Y chromosomes. Females are XX, males are XY. Okay, every single human, you have to have an X chromosome because you have super important genes on your X chromosome. So if you are wondering, for instance, the likelihood of having a boy or a girl, that's going to be dictated by your sex chromosomes. It doesn't have anything to do with your autosomes at all. It just has to do with your sex chromosomes. So if you put a female XX together with a male XY, and you fill out your Punnett square, you can see that you have a 50% chance of producing a female and a 50% chance of producing a male. Every single fertilization event is the same probability. Okay, now there's a little bit of research that this is a little sticky, meaning that if you have a family with 13 girls and you're like, there's something going on here. But if these couples who say that you have 5 girls in your, like, as your siblings, or 5 boys. So if those people kept reproducing, they would have a boy. It is like they would eventually have a boy, because every single fertilization event is not dictated by the one that came before it, okay? So your likelihood at every single fertilization event, it's 50%. You either are going to have a girl or you're going to have a boy. 50% for girl, 50% for boy. So which gamete, the sperm or the egg, determines the sex of your offspring? Well, how would you figure this out? The sex of your offspring, the biological sex of your offspring, is determined by their sex chromosomes, right? And those sex chromosomes is going to determine the genitalia that you're producing. It just is what it is. So if a female has 2 X chromosomes, what is the only sex chromosome that she can give? X. If a male has an X and a Y chromosome, what are the sex chromosomes he could give? He could give an X, and if the male gives an X chromosome, his offspring will be a biological female. If he gives a Y, his offspring would be a biological male, because every single one of these offspring has at least one X that came from your mom. So guys, your X chromosome came from your mother. Thank her for giving you life. All right, so what is an X-linked disorder? An X-linked disorder is a disorder that is linked to your X chromosome. And these disorders can be recessive or dominant, and they have very weird inheritance patterns. That's because if you have a recessive trait, you have to have 2 messed up alleles, 2 recessive alleles to express that trait. So females would have to have 2 recessive alleles on her X chromosome. However, if you only have 1 X chromosome, like in a male, even a recessive trait will act like a dominant trait if you have a recessive gene on that X chromosome, okay? So you have genes on that chromosome. You don't have a recessive X, it's just genes on those chromosomes. So if you have a recessive gene on your only X chromosome, there's nothing to cover it up. There's going to be no dominant trait to cover that up. So they will be affected more often than females. And then if it's dominant, all right, so think about it. A recessive trait, you need 2 recessive alleles to show a recessive trait. A dominant disorder, in a dominant disorder, you only need to have a single dominant allele to show that trait. All right, so X-linked recessive disorders affect more males than females. We are not going over this. I'm not gonna do this to you, but they affect more males than females. Just know that. And the reason why they do is because, again, your Y in an X-linked disorder doesn't carry anything, okay? So whatever is over here will not be able to mask what's over here because they're completely different chromosomes. So if you have, yeah, all right, so examples of X-linked recessive disorders are red-green color blindness and hemophilia A. And for Y, it's because he only has a single X chromosome. And again, just in general, when you're dealing with sex-linked genes, they are genes that are linked to your sex chromosomes. So instead of doing big H, little h, your big H and little h are linked to your X chromosomes, okay? But you don't need to know how to do this. I won't ask you how to do it on your exam or anything. It gets complicated, and then everybody wants to put an H on your Y, and I'm just not dealing with it. All right, so females must receive a recessive allele on both X chromosomes to express an X-linked recessive disorder. Males only need to inherit 1. Yes, guys. All right, we're here. We're done. That was it for inheritance. Congratulations. We are to your memes. Mendel's genetics research suffers a temporary setback. All the Austrian monks at the monastery, menu pea soup. Gregor Mendel giving peas a chance since 1856. So cute. Why is the occurrence of gene mutations from DNA replication low? DNA checks itself before it wrecks itself. True. Checkpoints in the cell cycle. Like, maybe the best answer ever. Using chromosomes in advertising because, you know, sex cells, you get it? Sperm and egg. God damn. All right, congratulations. We are done once again, and you have survived another chapter. So our last chapter is going to be next week, and it's going to cover the reproductive system. Okay, so yeah, have a great day.